Hi there, it's Rob. Congratulations on your recent show role allocation as a Chief Sound Operator and or Media Content Operator, Video Operator. This podcast is basically an introduction and a confirmation of the role of the Head of Sound or the Sound Operator in production. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk for a little bit about how the role fits into the overall production team, and also the key skills and documentation which you'll be expected to use during your role as sound operator. And then we'll go through and talk about some of the key responsibilities during the show process. All of this will work towards you getting a better understanding of the role and also improve your practice and to hopefully, in this case, get a better mark. So what I would do is I would get yourself a set of notes, take down some ideas based on this podcast, and then you can go from there, knowing that you know a little bit more about your new role as sound operator. Okay, so there's a lot of different show types and role types in this area, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to, just for the purposes of this podcast, I'm going to call the whole thing sound operator, but that of course may well include a certain amount of sound design on smaller shows, so it might include sourcing content and designing content. It also probably in lots of shows will include a certain amount of video, projection and visual media stuff. So there's a lot of different roles in this space, but we'll call it one thing, but it does relate to a number of different disciplines. This also relates to the industry where there are all kinds of people doing all sorts of different things in this space, whether they be just playing back a few effects during a theatre show, often alongside maybe the DSM does it, or maybe the lighting operator will operate lighting and sound, right through to large musicals, which obviously have a number of sound crew actually running the show, and also bands and other music stuff. And then you come down to the video side of things, where you could be quite a complex video playback, in which case in certain shows there'll obviously be a dedicated video crew and video operators to deal with that. Generally though, the role of sound operator, sort of head of sound or whatever, sits somewhere below the sound or media designer, a bit like a lighting designer in theatre really, but the sound designer obviously chooses any content, designs and mixes any particular sounds they want. They may well have opinions on what microphones they're going to use for sound reinforcement purposes. They'll certainly have opinion as to where they want to put speakers in the auditorium, and so that's what the sound designer does. The sound operator or head of sound, you're sort of slightly below that, so you're basically facilitating that. You're helping the sound designer to achieve what they want. You also probably run a few assistants. It's particularly on a busy show. It may well be on a small show. It may be that you're kind of combined sound designer and operator and also don't really have any assistants, particularly if you were just having a show that was just playing back a bit of content via QLab, for example. On a larger show, you'd have assistants, you have sound crew, and quite often in sound and in other areas, the sort of sound assistant roles are often allocated by a number. So maybe there'll be a sound number 2, which might mean almost like you think the deputy sound or the main sound assistant. And then they might say a number 3, which is a slightly less senior role. Again, a sound number 3 may well be in charge of fitting and running radio mics on a musical. The number 2 might be involved with dealing with the racks, or maybe a certain amount of operation themselves. So that's where the assistants come in. Now, in university shows, we tend to maybe only have a maximum of 2 assistants on the larger musicals, because there's obviously more to do and things like that. As I mentioned before, the role really varies greatly according to the requirements of the show. So some might be just a bit of playback. Some, particularly dance shows, might be playback but with a lot of different bits of content that basically the whole show hangs around, including multiple projector systems. And then it moves on right onto the large musicals, including the mixing of a live band and microphones, and running a very complex show every night. Basically, all the roles and the requirements for the roles depend on the kind of complexity of the show. But what we're going to do is we're going to talk about some of the key skills as sound operator. To start off with then, I think the key one to anything, whether it be stage management, lighting or construction or anything, is organisation and planning. Being a sound operator or head of sound is no different. It's mostly basic stage management skills. You assume nothing and you leave nothing to chance, and you manage out any potential issues before you get into the venue. That might be including planning of equipment, the testing of equipment, all that sort of thing. But it's basically an organisation and preparation skills. Also, the same as any technical role, the skills of being a methodical worker, and also your good practice in terms of tidiness when it comes to cabling and that is very important, particularly when you have problems arise. So one of the things I get very hot on is people doing good practice when it comes to cabling tidiness, not just from a safety point of view, but also from a fault finding point of view. If you do end up having faults happen on a sound system, and it's likely that you will in a show environment, that's made a lot easier by good working practices, including extremely comprehensive marking up of the equipment. One of the things I try and encourage a lot, particularly with sound crews, is to make sure they mark things very, very heavily in terms of cable ends and where things plug in and stuff all over the sound desk. Make lots of markings using tape and pen, so that if you have any problems, you can just go back to a particular point and you can see instantly what one cable relates to. Obviously, from a sound operator's point of view, you need to have a certain amount of understanding of the equipment and the systems. Sound systems are quite complex, or can seem quite complex, and they're much more complicated than lighting systems in some ways, particularly conventional lighting systems, because there's so many different bits to them, and the way a sort of sound mixer works, even an analog sound mixer, seems fantastically complicated to people who are just starting out. Obviously, also, these roles in TP often involve also video projection and dealing with file formats and resolutions and stuff like that, and that can bring a whole other dimension to it. So a certain understanding of the equipment systems is going to be required, possibly more so than a lighting operator who just has to sit there and press go every night. It's also important, although the sound designer will design the system, it's important that the operator knows how to plug them up. And again, every mixer is different, every piece of equipment has got different inputs and outputs and stuff like that. It's important that you're able to prioritise work that needs doing, and also to record things. So maybe writing lists of things that have been yet to be done, things that need sorting out, and just kind of keeping a running tally of things that you need to do, things that you have done. Particularly in sound, I always think there's always a point where you're working towards the next point. So it may well be the next point is the sound check, the band coming in. The next point might be your hour over tea time when you get to check levels. It might be a point when the director's coming in to do the plot. There's always this next point in sound, and that's what you should try and work towards. It does mean that it means basically that you can try and get all of your stuff out of the way, and you know that you're ready for this next point. One thing I don't think sound really is particularly intrusive when people are working, and it can also be dangerous, as the same way as a blackout can be dangerous when people are trying to put sets together. So it's important to realise that the points that you get to make sound are not just generally scattered throughout the day. They're normally at certain points that have been allocated in the schedule, and you're always working towards that next point and prioritising things that need doing up till then. Like any management role, if you're head of sound and running a small team, you have to be able to work with other people and also to keep them busy. The main thing with sound is actually more important than running the team, which obviously is important, is actually managing your relationship with company and artists and directors and stuff like that. Sound can be quite a people-facing business. Either you're fitting radio mics to people, or you're talking to musicians about how you would like to mic up their instrument, or asking them if they would like to plug in, or asking them if they have enough sound in their monitor. And so, other than just a straight show where you're just playing back sounds and you just have to deal with the sound designer telling you what levels things are at, it's a very people-facing business, and much more so than lighting is. When it comes to show running, unless it's a very simple show, multitasking is a good skill for a sound operator, and being able to keep good notes during rehearsals. It also means marking stuff like your levels and things, just basically keeping good records of things so that you can go back to a particular point in the show. Sometimes, particularly on a complex show, sound can seem quite complex because you're not just going back to an LX cue. On most sound desks, especially the ones we use in university, you don't have the luxury of being able to go back to Q4 and just knowing that it's all set up. You need to understand where you are in the show and what settings you have and stuff like that. And it's this kind of mindset of multitasking mindset that's very important in sound operation. The sort of key paperwork that you'll be working with as sound operator is either created by you or the sound designer themselves. I think the key one is the channel list or the input list. That's the one that documents where every single source goes into the desk, into the mixer, and then where it comes out afterwards, which amplifiers it goes to and stuff like that. On a simple show with just a QLab output, that may well just be 2 channels, and obviously that's not very important. On a very large show with multiple microphones, a large band, and also a lot of radio mics, that kind of channel input list is very important and is the kind of pivot point for everything else. It's a bit similar in some ways to the Bible that is the lantern schedule in lighting, for example. Other documentation you may well have is a stage or a pit plan. Again, that's to do with where people are, musicians are, where they're plugged in, where their microphones are, where their DI boxes are, that sort of thing, and also where any monitoring is. Alongside of that, of course, there would be a speaker plot which shows the sound designer shows where they want particular speakers to be, and may well include some cable routing information as well. A bit like lighting, again, a list of cues, so a sound cue synopsis, or a list of media or content. How that actually works itself out is quite show dependent, but basically there's always some point where you have a list of the things that are needed in the show from a recorded media point of view. And also another list you'll have is probably as an equipment inventory. So any piece of kit you need, any additional speakers, any outboard effects, anything else that you need. Basically, if you imagine you had to take the whole show on a truck over to the desert somewhere, and you didn't have facility to go and wander into the store and get anything else, what would you need to put on that list? In sound, that particularly includes a lot of cabling, because there's a lot of different things in different cables in sound. And if you don't have a particular cable, then a particular piece of equipment won't plug to another piece of equipment. There's just so many variables in terms of connector type and all that sort of thing. You may well have other paperwork on your show as well, maybe a mic plot for a radio mic system, so almost like an availability chart of where people, which people have which mics in which scene. And then the sound designer or yourself may well have produced frequency plans for the radio mics, or patch lists for where things are plugged into in particular stage boxes and how they patch into different parts of the system. Again, all these are quite show dependent, but they're all sorts of things that you may well be looking towards. It's the kind of paperwork you would really need to be able to plan a show. The final thing is to do with show running, so that may well include cue sheets or a marked up script in the case of a live musical, showing entrances and exits and what mics are where. Live musicals tend to work off a marked script rather than off a sheet. In the old days, cue sheets used to tell you which machine you were playing back stuff on, what the levels were, how many desk settings were, whether things were panned left and right and all that sort of thing. Quite a lot of the cue sheet function now are taken away from us and put into playback software such as QLab. So a lot of that sort of thing you don't need to have. What I would advise, and the sheets are available for the Soundcraft, which is the desk in the UT, is markup sheets of how your desk is set up. So that if for any reason your desk had to be swapped out because it had a fault with it, or if someone just came and messed it up before the show, you'd be able to set everything back as it was, because there's a lot of knobs and buttons on those sound desks, and a good record of a good point in the show, some checks to check that everything's set, is particularly worthwhile. Okay, so finally then let's just talk about a few of the responsibilities of the sound operator. In terms of pre-production, obviously one of the most important things is the collating of the sound and media content, maybe preparing it for playback if the sound designer needs you to, and also to put together a QLab file in quite a lot of cases, particularly in university shows. When it comes to media content, it's very important that you check that the formats will actually work before getting to the venue. So the formatting and the codecs that are used on the media, particularly visual media, can either work or not work, and sometimes things need re-encoding and stuff. And that's all fine, it can all be done. It's best not to do it just when you're trying to do the sound plot or whatever. So it's particularly important for media-driven shows and dance festivals and stuff with multiple acts and a complex content requirement. When it comes to getting media for these festivals, it's important to try and get it in early as possible. Try and get to make sure that the content is submitted in the format you want it to be, and also in the sort of resolutions and everything. But don't forget, when you're trying to get your content in early, it may well be that the artist may not have finished creating files for the first few weeks of production period. It's all very well pressing them, but if they haven't finished making the video or haven't finished editing it, you're not going to get very far. It's a sort of a bit of a balance. Outside of the media stuff from a pre-production point of view, then gathering information from the sound designer and both for the sound designer as well. Maybe the sound designer needs some information on the system specification, and also they'll give you information as to what they want. It may well be that part of your remit is to plan the sort of system side of things, how things are plugged up and stuff in different venues, and the allocation of particular equipment in different venues. For instance, in a tour where the equipment is not always the same. That very much depends on the show. You certainly can assist in the sourcing of and testing of equipment such as additional microphones or speakers or stuff. In the university, obviously, we do that via the asset store. But basically, there's that sort of assistant to the sound designer element, which is where you're able to help them source the things they need to get the show together. As sound operator, you may well also take part in scheduling decisions on the sound activities, including asking for time, allocations for your sound checks with artists, or maybe time to plug up an orchestra when they're seated, or stuff like that. So you may well take part in those decisions, and certainly do make sure that you ask the production manager or ask the sound designer to allocate you enough time to do things that you need to do. A lot of stuff can be done concurrently with other departments during the LX get-in, particularly in sound, as that a lot of the sound work happens up at the desk or in different parts of the venue that may well not be the same parts as the LX team are working or the set team are working. So a lot of that can be done concurrently. But certainly from a sound point of view, the one thing you need in sound is quiet, in the same way that LX team will need some darkness at some point. And it's important to make sure that that's scheduled in. Part of your remit might include ordering and ensuring everything is prepared and tested ready for the sound get-in. And again, this is including additional equipment, hires and stuff. The key stumbling block in sound, as I said before, is the number of different connectors there are, and the cables that are required to plug one thing up from another can be very specific, and you need to make sure you know how to get that CD player plugged into the desk, or how to get that iPod into a thing, or how some particular piece of a submixer works or something. It's just a question of making sure you either have the adapters or the cables specifically for that task. When it comes to leading the team, obviously you can assess the abilities of your crew. Sound operator is a bit more of a sort of a lone job in some ways. Obviously, you might have an assistant or something to run around and do stuff for you, go down and move microphones and stuff. But it's not as much of a team thing as being on an LX crew. It's more of a sort of an individual's up at the sound desk doing their thing kind of thing. So, but there will be some opportunity probably to lead a small team. And you need to make sure that your team are obviously, safe and well, and they manage to take their breaks and they go off in time to come back for the sound hour or whatever like that. So you're kind of being a bit of a sort of a manager stroke mummy to your team. What you should also do is make sure that others stick to the schedule. And while you shouldn't make nuisance sound during their time, whether it be set building or people setting deads in the flies or calling of the focus, you should also, that's fine, that's great. I would never advocate sound just randomly throughout the day, but you make sure that if you are allocated a quiet time, it is a quiet time, and people don't just carry on working over dinner just because, they thought, oh, it doesn't matter, I'm not going to have my dinner now, I'm just going to carry on jigsawing, and because that is the time that you were allocated, and it's important to make sure that's stuck to. If a sound designer has work for you or your team, it's usual to sort of create a snagging list of things that still need doing. In relation to sound and that, it may well be faults. It's quite often things like moving microphones or checking the levels of specific cues with the sound designer, or maybe on a radio mic type show, it would be dealing with any RF issues on testing for radio frequency dropout and stuff like that. So there's a different set of snagging things to an LX role, and hopefully with sound there shouldn't be too many faults. If you've done a lot of the preparation and you've plugged up everything correctly, you shouldn't have faults, and you certainly shouldn't. You should get rid of all your faults during the fit up, and that's what testing's all about. Testing is all about being ready, not going, oh, I've just pushed up that fader and nothing's happened, but I didn't know that because this is the first time we've done it, and now we've got a director sat here and the sound designer's waiting to plot. So more of the snagging would be to do with little bits of titivating stuff or changing things or making adjustments to stuff. If you do make changes to the actual sort of system itself, make sure you assist the sound designer in noting the changes or deviations from the original plan. So updating the input list, changing the patch or whatever, just keeping on top of the system setup so that the paperwork's always current, so people don't go back and find that they thought that they'd unplugged a microphone from this, but it actually had changed roles and it was that cable was now doing something else. Obviously, as operator, we finally get to the operating bit, which is that you should understand how to run the sound equipment, and also you should assist the sound designer with some critical listening when required. But don't sort of spend. If you are working with a sound designer, it's probably not a good idea to spend endlessly to make helpful suggestions. Sound's quite subjective, and there should be only really one person making the decision. During the show running, obviously, the sound op may well make your own decisions. Particularly on a live show, live mixing show, because that's what a sound operator does. They mix the show live. But there's a balance between being helpful to the sound designer and also just kind of coming up with a second opinion, which nobody needs. The key thing with sound, the sound designer and the director, but particularly with performers, is to keep their confidence. The thing about confidence is that it can shatter people's confidence in your ability to do your job as a sound operator, and what that feeds into, whereas in other departments it may well feed into different parts of other people's practice. From a performer's point of view, if they start getting edgy about the sound and they're not in a position where they can just forget about their mic, or they know that cue's coming, then their confidence goes and it makes their performance terrible, and it just basically, the whole thing comes crashing around your ears. In order to maintain confidence, the main thing is to try and work to avoid things like worrying feedback or loud, unplanned noises and stuff, while performers and directors particularly are around in the room. So get all of the unpleasantness and all of the testing of your gear and squeaking microphones and having all that sort of thing happen when there's no one else around. Then when the performers come in, hopefully the system just works, and their cues happen when they're expected to happen, their microphones go on when they're supposed to and go off when they're supposed to. And if you have everything ready for them before they walk in the door, and then you can set their monitor levels with them or whatever, and the band are happy and everything, it's a lot easier. When people start to lose confidence in the sound side of things, their performances go down a hill pretty quickly. It's different if with lighting, people don't sort of notice the lighting on stage, but if someone's wearing a radio mic, they notice whether it's crackling, they notice whether it's feeding back while they're trying to sing, etc. So keeping confidence is key, and again that comes to the sound roles being a much more people-facing role than perhaps lighting. Finally, when it comes to projected media on performance shows such as dance festivals and stuff, again, the people side of things, it's very important to manage your relationship with performers well. It's kind of a bit of a balance between being able to perform miracles on QLab at the drop of a hat and then having them expect you to be able to do it. The thing with yourselves and them is that computer technology shouldn't replace planning of content and making sure things are correct before you walk into the venue. It's great that you can perform magical things during their technical rehearsal that they hadn't thought of in a few minutes, but there's a balance to be struck there. Again, the key thing is keeping the performers' confidence and their understanding that you are working towards their show being as good as it possibly can be. Okay, so there's some ideas for you for the role of sound operator, head of sound. As I say, it's very much a people-based business, and it's a lot of fun, and particularly for the live stuff, for complex live musicals and things, it can be a really, really exciting way to run a show. Good luck with it. I'm sure you do a great job, and I'll see you soon.